March 1930, they were called a protest, most in order to demand state funding for welfare, for support. And what happened was absolutely incredible. 500,000 people were on the streets in 25 cities. It was ferocious fighting in the streets, reported by the New York Times. But what was very important was that the movement won some gains. At the time, the government was completely against any kind of relief for the unemployed or the poor. But the mass movement was able to change the mass consciousness towards the need for the government to do something. In some ways, this opened the door as well for what was to follow later, which was the New Deal and massive government intervention. But this was the movement that broke the dam, broke the obstacle. And in that process, I mean, there's, we make all of this, we make it into a sentence. We say movement, we say struggle, we say, but that is where you have to read more of the testimonies from what happened at the time. And I think there's very important lessons for us too. There's the testimony of the Communist Party, agitators, organizers. All of a sudden, they have this thousands of people going to meetings. And they just told them, capitalism is a terrible system. So, especially at the time when they were in that sectarian term, they were worse than the Spartacist League. They just kept talking, capitalism is a terrible crisis. It was this. So there's this beautiful testimonies of workers who go to these mass meetings. There's two testimonies. It's the only little quotes I will give. And it says what happened. Because what happened was the unemployed and the people the workers were educating now the organizers. In one testimony, I don't have the time to give a full reading of that, of this, they were in a Greek organization, a club, and they told them, okay, what do you want us to do now? Yes, it's a crisis, but what should we do now? It was not enough to agitate against capitalism. They needed to link theory and abstract analysis with demands for action. It's a lesson for us today, not to stay with only propaganda at times. So these new tactics were born. People who were evicted from their homes, the Unemployed Council went and moved their houses back, moved their people back in their houses. This was not just 5 or 10. In New York City alone, it was 72,000 families. And you have to think that for every one family, 10 other families saw what happened. So it was a mass phenomenon. In another example from Chicago, again, the Communist Party sectarians, it's like capitalism, a big crisis. I read a quote. Julia, help me, okay? Okay. An elderly black man stood up and said, what do you folks figure on doing about this family that was thrown out of their house today? And so this movement found a way to win. Not everything, but to win victories for those workers. After 1930, the March 6th, which starts the big events. There was the National Hunger March, which began to consolidate the idea for federal unemployment insurance for all workers. And the demand was very important at the time, that it was to provide unemployment insurance for, regardless of race or sex, for women as well. Typically, in the past, Black workers, new immigrants, women would be excluded from benefits, except to beg for charity, philanthropy. And most important, it was the demand at cities and states to provide benefits. And some benefits were won, some benefits at that time, some. The big benefits, Chris will talk about later. But this was the battering ram to break down the initial resistance, to open the door, this movement. It is ironic, you see pictures from the time, thousands of workers, of the unemployed. The Communist Party was still tone deaf. Does that make sense? It was singing, they were playing rumbas and they were singing fandangos, you know. Their main demand was defend the Soviet Union, which was correct, but out of tune, not in. But it showed an enormous. I will try to wrap up, Cora. I cannot see you, but I know I'm getting close to time. There is much more we can say. I want to encourage comrades to read some of that exciting literature we sent out. Very important lessons that I learned from reading and rereading some of that is the role of the program, the importance of the program. That the program is intended to unite the different sections of the working class, the unemployed and the employed, those who are better paid and less paid, those who are different groups. Program aims to unite the working class. It showed the importance of linking to action, which I can say it in one word, is really the science of knowing what to do next. Not what you're going to do in 2 years or 5 years, but what to do next. How to win the next victory. And in that victory, what? I'm looking at Julie, I cannot hear you, Cora. The need for clear demands, sharp, clear demands that link the immediate with the aim of the need to transform society. My time is almost up. If Cora wants to correct me.
That's right.
Okay. Okay. I wanted to say that it's a very interesting and very exciting, and I think there's enormous amounts of lessons that can be learned. And Chris will take it from a point where the movement of the unemployed and the employed comes together and sets the stage for the transformative movement of the working class, the heavy battalions, and so on. So I will stop there and thank you again, Cora.
Thanks, Alan, and thanks, comrades, for attending the workshop. So as Alan talked about, I'm going to talk more about some of the kind of high watermark of the unemployment councils, and then their connection to the growth of the labor movement and the growth of the CIO in the US. And in March 1932, the Communist Party led unemployment councils and red unions led a march against Ford auto plant. 3,000 people marched on the Ford plant. And if people remember, Henry Ford was sympathetic to fascists. The march was attacked by the police. And in the end, there were 5 dead, 75 wounded, and 30,000 people attended the funeral procession the following few days. And this was sort of the high watermark of the Communist Party-led unemployment councils and was seen as the beginning of the fight to build the CIO. And Alan talked about some of the challenges with the unemployment councils, and I'll go over a couple of those right now. One challenge they faced was the instability of life that comes with being an unemployed worker. Many of the unemployed councils were made up of a small core of activists, and they had wider peripheries, but they weren't involved the whole time. And of course, the unemployment councils had a lot of power, as Alan described, but they lacked the power to shut down production. And the other major issue facing the unemployment councils, as Alan pointed out, was the Stalinist third period sectarianism and ultra-leftism. And this left the unemployment councils, this left the Communist Party unprepared for the events of 1934. So because of the ultra-leftism and sectarianism, many working class people and unemployed people looked to other forms of struggle beyond the Communist Party Unemployment Council. And one of those organizations was in the American Midwest. It was called the Conference of Progressive Labor Action. People will know its founder, A.J. Muste. This organization started out as an unemployment council as well, but it played a decisive role in one of the strikes that rebuilt the American labor movement. And what happened was in 1934, there was a series of 3 strikes, which were led by Marxists of different varieties, and it led to much larger victories. So the Unemployment Council, when the strike was starting, the Unemployment Council took a position that it would not scab or cross the picket lines. And when the union went on strike, initially the courts said that the picket lines were illegal, and the union backed down. And so the company found 1,800 people to scab, and it looked like the strike was going to be a defeat. 2 of the main activists of the Unemployment Council decided to go picket anyway, and they were arrested and put in jail. And there was a mass public outcry, and there was a mass march on the jail, and they were released. And the following day, there were 10,000 people picketing the factory, making sure scabs couldn't enter. The National Guard was mobilized, and they tried to escort the scabs into the factory with arms. So what you saw was the Unemployment Council and the striking workers physically confronted the National Guard and the company. So they took bricks and they put them in the rubber of the tires and launched them at the National Guard. And the mainstream media described the scene as a war zone. They were especially outraged at women being on the picket lines, helping to throw bricks and load the catapults. The National Guard shot back. There were 2 strikers killed and 75 more wounded. However, this only escalated the struggle, and within a week, 98 of 99 local unions had agreed to a general strike. And this was decisive for winning. And in the end, the Toledo strike was seen as one of the first major victories of industrial unionism. One other example from 1934 took place in Minneapolis, and I'll be shorter with this example. Minneapolis, there was more than one strike. There was one in February and 2 more in May and July in 1934. In between the two, the Trotskyist leadership of the strike made extensive plans to build solidarity amongst unemployed workers and the labor movement. And like Alan described, there were 30,000 unemployed workers in the city of about 500,000, and they were dominated by the Communist Party unemployment councils. So there was a protest in April. 2 of the unemployment council activists were arrested and put in jail. The Stalinists resisted any attempt to organize solidarity campaigns because, as Alan described, everyone but them was a fascist. But the Trotskyists knew that the working class wanted unity, and it wanted a united fight to be able to organize. And so they organized a massive labor solidarity campaign in defense of the unemployed council activists who were arrested. And this act of solidarity diminished the influence of the Communist Party amongst the unemployed at a crucial moment before the strike. And when the Communist Party made sectarian attacks against the strikes, unemployed workers didn't listen and they sided with the strikers. And like in Toledo, the press complained bitterly about the unemployed workers who would go to the picket lines and raise hell. And I think one of the general lessons out of this is it's counterintuitive that at a time where there's mass unemployment, there were successful strike actions. And I think this really points to the success of the organizing that was done at building class solidarity that was essential to win both unemployment benefits, but also strikes. And these 2 strikes combined with one more in 1934 would pave the way for millions of workers joining the CIO, which is one of the major American union federations. And obviously there was, to some extent, objective space for the growth of the CIO, that capitalism was changing and industrial unions were the form of the future. But that objective space was only filled by the subjective victories of the leadership of the Trotskyists and the strikes. And those victories were, a crucial part of those victories was correctly having an orientation to the unemployed struggles and bringing them into the fight. And I want to point out too that it wasn't just a victory in the sense where millions of workers joined unions, that was a victory in terms of quantity. But it was also a major victory in terms of quality, that you had in the unions. The Stalinists went from organizing sectarian parallel unions to being best friends with the union leaderships in fighting the Marxists. One of the most important parts of this was the Popular Front, which was a change from the Stalinist sectarianism to them uniting with a liberal section of the ruling class. And the communist parties did this overnight across the world. In the unemployment councils, this meant taking the movement out of the streets and connecting it to the policies of the Roosevelt administration itself. So for example, in 1934, there was a spike in the Great Depression and unemployment went back to, and there were major missed opportunities because of these policies. President Roosevelt did not increase the relief funds, and he actually cut back on the New Deal budgets at that time. And so there was almost no fight back and no street protests in response to the crisis of 1938. And this is strange when you think of between the time Alan's talking about in 1938, the CIO developed, and there should have been a bigger fight back than there was. And the other side effect of the Popular Front was it blocked revolutionary Marxists from gaining more of an influence than they could have. Another major missed opportunity for the US working class came in 1940, the 1940 presidential election. One of the biggest weaknesses with the United States is the working class never built a social democratic party to fight for its interests. The genuine Marxists, people like James Cannon and folks around at the time, argued that such a party should exist. And there were millions of working class people who agreed, who had watched Roosevelt attack strikers during the CIO, who had watched him do very little for the unemployed. And so both the Stalinist Popular Front, their alliance with Roosevelt, and the union bureaucracy blocked the path in 1940 to an independent workers' party. The final thing that happened was these things left the US working class unprepared for the challenges of World War II. Instead of an independent, anti-imperialist working class opposition to war and fascism, instead of that, they were left with President Roosevelt's nationalism and the defense of American democracy. And genuine Marxist ideas were isolated, often with the help of the Stalinists, and even repressed by the state. And just with my last minute, I'll talk about how this affected Marxists in the US. Because of their isolation and the challenges of World War II and Trotsky's death, the American Marxist movement had a lot of challenges. They made a lot of mistakes. And they exited the Second World War with bad perspectives, which led them to decades of crisis and splits and isolation. And those lessons are for another workshop, but they are related to the challenges that came out of the 1930s that Marxists face in this period. And of course, that's why for ourselves, having events like this and discussions like this can be essential for us to avoid those mistakes of the past and build a healthy revolutionary international that's prepared for the coming period.